clock. It's very good of you to look at your clocks. Clock. Very good. So the Torah is called Mashal HaKadmoni, which means the primordial analogy. Why is it called a primordial analogy? Because God is, even though God manifests himself through the encompassing light known as Sovev Kol, God manifests himself through the internal light, which is Memali Kol, that's the dimension of God that we have a relationship with. But God's essence is beyond comprehension. In other words, I think a simple example of this is human beings can interact with each other. We can interact with each other on a emotional level, intellectual level, physical level. But there's a part of us, the essence of who we are, that is beyond description. Right? When we say we can connect on an emotional level, that means that my emotions and your emotions are connecting. There's an expression. I am not my emotions. I have emotions. I am not my intellect. I have intellect. So when two human beings connect, we're connecting on some accessible dimension, but the essence is beyond description. It's not that we can't connect with the essence. It's just beyond description, beyond a definition that allows for us to intentionally connect with that. And God relates to creation in a similar way. There's God as he is encompassing, Sovev Kol, where God's holiness, so to speak, is equally manifest in all of existence. And then there's God as he makes himself accessible to each creation intentionally, and that would be different, whether you're an angel or a human or an animal or an inanimate object. But God's essence is beyond that kind of description and beyond that kind of accessibility. So how do we get to know God's essence? By definition, if we say we're trying to get to know, that means we want to understand. But the truth is we can't know God's essence, but we can know God's essence in the sense of knowledge being we can experience God's essence. How do we experience God's essence? We experience God's essence by way of this example of a primordial analogy, which means when an idea is too profound to comprehend, so we give an analogy. You don't necessarily know the idea from the analogy, but you have a relationship with it. You can connect with it. Now, with intellect, when you study the analogy, you get to know the subject matter better, even though the teacher is only communicating the analogy. With God, we actually can experience God through the analogy, but not necessarily understand God. Now, where do we get the analogy? Where's the analogy of God? That's the Torah. The Torah is the primordial analogy. When we study Torah, we get to see the mirror image, so to speak, of the divine. Now, when you know the analogy, I'll deviate for a second. We last week, or the week before last, we concluded the study of the Rambam, Maimonides. In the censored copy of Maimonides, especially in these last two chapters, there were things that were removed from the print of Maimonides. Throughout the generations, when the Jewish people encountered countries that wanted to exert their control over the Jews, they would intentionally try to remove certain texts, especially texts that they found offensive to their particular religions and so on. So in the text of the Rambam writes something interesting. He says that, he actually spells it out in pretty explicit words. He said that why did God allow for Yeshua HaNotzri, which means Jesus of Nazareth, V'oisa HaYishmaeli, and that Ishmaelite, a reference to Muhammad, why did God allow for these religions to manifest? Right? And if you think about it, Judaism is, the Jews are like tiny portion of the world's population. And as a faith, even if we have outsized influence on the world, the reality is there are many billions more Christians and Muslims than there are Jews. And that's the Rambam's question. Why did God allow for that to rise, especially that there's been so much suffering as a result of it? So the Rambam says something interesting that I want to tie back to here. He says, all of these faiths believe in redemption. They preach redemption. And they preach the concept of Mashiach, of a Messiah. When Mashiach comes, they're already well-versed. They know the analogy. They know the concept. What they're going to realize is, oh, we got the right idea, the wrong guy. That's what the Rambam says. He says they're already familiar, and they'll say that our ancestors gave us the wrong information, but at least they're familiar with the idea. I think that's a good parallel to what the Alter Rebbe is telling us here, is that when one studies Torah, and we come to the next world, and in the next world we get to see divine revelation. Here it's concealed, but in the next world we see the divine revelation. We say, oh, that's what it is. I'm familiar with the idea. I've been studying it. I've read the analogy. I've spent my whole life studying the analogy. And that's the saying that our sages say, that one, fortunate is one who comes to that world and is bringing with them their study. Because when you bring with you your study, then when you see the real deal, you say, oh, I'm familiar with it, right? You ever have that experience? You say, oh, that's what he was talking about. That's what they were talking about. That's what it is, right? That's called das, by the way. That's called knowledge. Knowledge it's not intellectual. It's familiarity. It's a feeling. It's a feeling of knowing something, of connecting with something. Okay. So last week we began to analyze this idea that it says of King Solomon. We know that King Solomon was the wisest of all men. And our sages say that what made him so wise, that King Solomon, the Torah, the prophet says, he delivered 3,000 analogies. Right? What makes him so great is that on an intellectual idea, he was able to give 3,000 analogies. So the question is, does that mean he was a great storyteller? He was so brilliant that he was able to give 3,000 stories. Obviously, King Solomon's greatness wasn't that he was a great storyteller. If you gave me enough time, maybe not me, but gave someone enough time who's very creative, they can come up with a number of stories to explain an idea. Alter Rebbe says it's something more than that. So if you want to follow along, we're on page 18. This is what it says by King Solomon. That he gave 3,000 analogies. Pirush, this means, I'll call davar midivrei Torah, on every Torah concept, he would give 3,000 analogies. Let's read the English text here, because it captures this idea really nicely. Each spiritual world operates within its unique context. It is a different realm with a different frame of reference. King Shlomo perceived all of these realms and understood how every concept was expressed across all of these different levels. To illustrate by analogy, the term sweetness is applied in many different contexts. For example, one might describe a particular food as sweet, label a tune as sweet as a sweet melody, praise someone as having a sweet disposition, or even admire an idea as a sweet concept. Now, within each of these categories themselves, there are nuances. There are many different types of sweet foods, songs, and persons. However, the difference between two types of sweet food is of a completely diverse nature than the difference between sweet food and a sweet melody. The sweetness of both foods can be tasted by the palate, while the sweetness of a melody requires the use of higher senses, and the sweetness of a person's character or a profound idea cannot be perceived by our physical senses at all. Nevertheless, the same term is used to describe all four types of sweetness. In other words, the same motif can exist on different planes and in different forms, where the lower manifestation of the motif can be seen as an analogy for the higher one, right? So when we know that someone is a sweet person, we can understand the idea that there's a sweetness in food. Are they the same? Not at all. But we can draw a parallel between them. We can use one as an analogy for the other. Within Torah ideas, we have layers and layers and layers of depths to an idea. So King Solomon could provide 3,000 analogies for every Torah concept. In other words, he would see and explain every Torah idea as it existed on 3,000 planes of existence. Right? It's not just that he was a good storyteller. Each analogy basically described something deeper, something higher. Now, why the number 3,000? So he says that we know there are 10 sephiros, there are 10 core building blocks to all of existence. And 1,000 can symbolize 10 to the power of 3. And we know there are 3 primary worlds, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. And so King Solomon understood in these 3 worlds every layer of understanding as they can exist. And he continues, Dahainu. Shadavar azeh musig began Eden atachten kach, ubegan Eden ha'elyon davar zeh atzmi ube'inyin ruchni v'nai le'yeser. In the lower Garden of Eden, it's understood in one dimension. Do we have the wrong pages there? There should be another batch of copies there. Look at the bottom of the pile. Those are probably the ones that have more pages in it. You got it? No? Here, you can use the book there. Theoretically, if you understand 3,000 layers, do you mind? Oh, she's there. If you can understand, somebody's getting it. If you can understand 3,000 layers of teaching, right? So the lowest, so to speak, the first layer is morning. If you can understand 3,000 layers of ideas, the lowest layer would be an analogy for a higher layer, right? If we're trying to understand the sweetness of a person, the sweetness of food is just an analogy. Let's get these papers straight here. Push them over to me. Good morning. Oh, we're making problems here.
Thank you.
Welcome. Good morning.
What?
Oh,
I can.
Okay, we're actually almost at page 21, so hang tight. So, right, so if we're trying to understand the sweetness of a person, you can't possibly compare the sweetness of food to the sweetness of a person. But we can. What do I mean you can't compare it? When I say you're a sweet person, it doesn't mean if I taste you that you're going to taste sweet, right? But what does sweet food mean? It means it's pleasant, it's enjoyable, right? It touches a certain part of our psyche. When I meet a sweet person, I mean that the sweetness of sugar indicates that this is a sweet person, as opposed to the bitterness of food or spicy food. You have a spicy person, or you have a bitter person, right? So the idea is that in ideas as well, the more profound an idea, our basic understanding of it becomes an analogy for the deeper dimension. Morning. Come sit. I don't. We got some. We're almost at page 21. We'll be there in a minute or an hour. Right? So we say that King Solomon understood 3,000, was able to give 3,000 analogies. It means that he understood all 3,000 levels of Torah. In truth, 3,000 is not really a fair number, because 3,000 is also a finite number. It may be a very big number. That's a lot of analogies. But the truth is that the praise of God, the verse says, is for eternity. It's infinite. So, or like the verse says, his understanding is beyond reckoning. In other words, 3,000, it's infinite, which is hard for us to really even understand what that means, but that's why we have the number 3,000 already gives us something to chew on. Okay, but the point is clear, that within intellectual comprehension, especially when we're dealing with spiritual comprehension, I'll give you another angle on this. This idea that we said that sometimes you encounter something, you say, that's what he was talking about, right? Somebody taught something intellectually to you, and then you actually encounter that idea as it's in practice. The person said words to you, and now you're experiencing something. It's two different things. But the words are an analogy that indicates about the thing you're experiencing. When we're dealing with the spiritual, there's infinite levels there. And each level of infiniteness, let's think about the spirituality of music, let's say, for example, or the spirituality of meditation. Even those two things are different. Let alone when you get to experience God, you experience the divine. Every level of divine experience is a totally different dimension. So in King Solomon's description, there's 3,000 levels. But in truth, there are layers upon layers. Just like we gave the example, two people can connect emotionally, you can connect intellectually, you can connect physically. Those are three different experiences that all are about connection. But they're three different types of connection. So they have in common that they're connection, but they're totally different types of connection. You can't compare two people connecting intellectually to two people connecting emotionally. And so it is spiritually. Okay, now let's dig into Torah. It says in the Zohar that the Torah emanates from God's wisdom, God's chachma, the first of the 10 sephiros. And they are, chachma is the source of all of the above mentioned levels of comprehension, right? Everything, because we're talking about spiritual comprehension, right? So all the levels of spiritual comprehension initiate in chachma, because chachma is the root of all intellect. Like it says in the verse, "V'nahar yotzeh me'Eden." It says, we are familiar with the verse at the beginning of the Torah, the beginning of Genesis. It says that a river flowed forth from Eden. What is Eden? So it says that Eden represents chachma, and the river is bina. Chachma being the initial spark of an idea. Bina is the development of an idea. So the river which is bina, right? It flows. Understanding flows. It originates in chachma. By the way, when we use the term chachma, wisdom, to talk about God, does God have wisdom? Is God wisdom? That's the better question. Is God wisdom? What do you think? Is God wisdom? Good. God is everything. So you said at least, that's great. What does that mean at least? What do you mean by at least? He must possess wisdom, right? But is God wisdom? You're not answering the question. Is God wisdom? Are you wisdom? Are you wisdom? I'm looking for a yes or no. Let me ask you something. When you were born, did you have wisdom? As we're discussing it here, you didn't. You had the potential for wisdom. You didn't have wisdom, but you still were you. Did you have, I like to say, you ask people, who are you? Who are you? So people answer, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a doctor, I'm a nice person. Like, think about it. If somebody were to randomly ask you, who are you? You'd probably give your name. You might give your profession. But that's not who you are. You actually can't answer who you are. You just know that you are. So if I ask, are you wisdom? The answer is no, I'm not wisdom. I possess wisdom. Am I kindness? No. Do I possess kindness? I hope so. Right? Who are you is beyond description. So can we say that God is wisdom? God is not wisdom. He possesses wisdom. And by the way, wisdom and kindness and all these other attributes are an expression of who we are. Like you said, if God, he's at least wisdom, meaning he must possess wisdom. If wisdom's a good quality, God has it. Right? But that doesn't define God. It's an expression of God. So the Torah, which is God's wisdom, or even the revelation in the Garden of Eden, is also not God. It's an expression of God. It may be a very lofty expression of God, but it's still not God. This makes sense? Yes?
Because we can be messengers of wisdom.
We can be messengers of wisdom, but we ourselves are not wisdom. By the way, this is a very important point, because what is the value of a human being is not what they have, it's what they are, right? It's a very critical distinction. Why is because every human being is created in the image of the divine. It doesn't say only if you have wisdom or kindness. Every human being is created in the image of the divine.
By the way, on that note, so how should Solomon have so much wisdom to answer 3,000 analogies? I can't even do 5 analogies on this cup.
Yeah, you could.
I could, but I gotta really push it, but 3,000, it seems above and beyond.
So it was a gift that God gave him. In the story, in the prophets, it says that God asked him, and he said that he wants nothing other than to serve God. And God said, because you had such humility, I will give you wisdom and wealth. And it was a gift that God gave him. What's the gift? The gift is the ability to see. What was the gift that Solomon had? It was the gift that God gave him, the ability to see the divine. Right? It's like, I think we said this last time, the idea that I can talk about the Grand Canyon from today till tomorrow, but if you see the Grand Canyon, you can give all the descriptors because you've seen it. That's what knowledge is, by the way. Knowledge is not, it's not intellectual, it's experiential. It's a fascinating passage that's brought down that says that the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was a 16th century Kabbalist, on Friday afternoon, it was a custom amongst the Kabbalists to take a nap, because spiritually in the heavens, certain things go on. And it's a time of kind of retreat. So Arizal dozed. I think it said he dozed for a half hour. And he said it would take 80 years to describe what he experienced in that half hour. What does that mean? Because he saw something. He saw something that's otherworldly. And when you see something that's when you experience something that's otherworldly, right? You see people who like have like these new experiences and they come back and they talk about it for days. The whole experience was all of 5 minutes, but they can talk about it for days. Why? Because they're trying to unpack something that they experienced. That's what knowledge is. That's what das is. So, bottom of page 20. So, even the sublime level of chachma, even the level of chachma itself is only an analogy for the primary being of the world. He's saying it in the positive, that chachma is, in a positive way, is an analogy for the primary being of the world, notwithstanding that the infinite light is exalted and it's infinitely higher than chachma, as we just said, right? God's light is infinitely higher than wisdom, because it's not wisdom, it's higher than wisdom. Page 21, those of you now that have a paper, and all of the 10 sephiros, the first of the 10, which is chachma, are referred in the Zohar as the secret of God's holy name, right? Even these high, lofty levels, they're called the secret of God's name. It doesn't say it's the secret of God's wisdom. It says it's the secret of God's name, right? What's included in those 10 levels? You have God's wisdom, you have God's kindness, you have God's discipline, you have God's sovereignty, right? All of these things, these are all, what are they called? They're called God's name. Like the name that a person has, we call a person by a name. The name is not the person. It doesn't touch the person's essence. It touches the person's essence, but it's not a descriptor of the person's essence. Nonetheless, so if even these high levels of wisdom are only the secret of God's name, in other words, they're only God's name, so how could we say that chachma is an analogy for God? If all it is a name, meaning it's removed, it's disconnected in a sense, so how are we saying that chachma is an analogy for God? That's the question. Nonetheless, God chose to manifest himself in the supernal level of chachma. Like it says in Ecclesiastes, in Proverbs, it says, Hashem, God, is in chachma. Do we need to elaborate on this? Do we got it? I want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about here.
I think it's interesting that we are not born with wisdom teeth, but they emerge later.
What happens when you get your wisdom teeth removed? So let me say it again, just so I said it again. What we're trying to do is we're trying to touch the essence of God. We're trying to connect with the essence of God. And what the Mimer is telling us is that when we study Torah, which is God's chachma, I'm going to use the Hebrew word chachma, meaning wisdom. We study Torah, which is God's chachma. We have the highest possibility of connection. Why? Because chachma is where God expresses himself. That's where God chose to manifest himself. By the way, amongst human beings, we do value the highest quality of intellectual accomplishment. right? That's the nature of human beings, because animals have emotions as well. A developed human being is one who has chachma, wise, wisdom. What we're saying is that the Torah is an analogy for God's essence. Even though when we look at the 10 Sephiros, when we look at these expressions of God, the Zohar tells us that all they are is just God's name, and a name is not the essence. So then how is it that when we are looking at Chachma, when we're studying Torah, we are accessing God's essence if the Chachma is only God's name? So the Alter Rebbe tells us that God chose to manifest himself in Chachma. It was a choice that he made, that where is God going to express himself? He's going to express himself in Chachma. Which is why, by the way, when a person speaks wisdom, we do get to experience who they are. We do get to experience who they are because they're expressing themselves in Chachma. But God intentionally chose to manifest himself in this particular experience. V'lachein, bottom of 22, which is why the Torah, which emanates from God's Chachma, is called the primordial analogy. He's going to repeat the same point, but emphasizing it. That just as an analogy, even though the analogy has nothing to do, it's completely made up of a different matter than the actual idea. Right? The story of the three bears is a story of animals and a fictitious story. But if you're using it to explain that you should check your food before you eat it, even though these are two different experiences, one's an intellectual instruction, one's a life instruction. I don't know what else the three bears is a good analogy for, but that's what came to mind, right? The analogy has nothing to do, it's made up of a different matter. And yet we use one to explain the other. But the reality is that the analogy actually, the analog is actually enclosed, it's manifest in the analogy. Right? If we're trying to explain the sweetness of a person, and we use the sweetness of food to explain that, so the sweetness of the person is expressed in the sweetness of the food. It lives inside the analogy of the sweetness of food. And it's specifically through that parable, through that analogy, through the sweetness of food, that you're able to understand what it means, the sweetness of a person. Right? You have, like, different cultures may not use the same terminology. Right? So somebody comes off the street and they're not very educated, and you say, "Oh, you're so sweet." You know, like Amelia Bedelia, and the person goes and actually tastes them, right? And that's not the point. But if you're going to try to explain to the person what it means, you're going to give the contrast that there's sweet food, there's bitter food, there's spicy food, and you have people who fit these different kind of categories. The descriptor, the idea of different types of personalities is expressed in the lemon and in the jalapeno and in the sugar. It lives in that analogy. So in a similar way, so when we study Torah, the Torah itself is containing within it the analog, which is the infinite light. Like the verse says in Psalms, God garbs himself in light as a garment. It's actually really, really powerful. We always talk about God and other spiritual experiences. We always talk about light. But God is not light. Light is a creation. So why do we use light as an analogy? Because there are a lot of properties about light that help us feel a similar experience. It's ethereal. You can't touch it. It's warm. It's manifest from a source. I mean, you can go on for hours talking about the properties of light and how they parallel God or the godly experience. But God is not light. But everything in Jewish mysticism refers to God as light. Why? Because light is an analogy for the divine manifestation. Therefore, when one studies Torah in this world, they're experiencing the analog, and therefore when they come to the next world and they experience the divine revelation there, which is also not light, but we're calling it light, they can actually appreciate what they're experiencing, and they can have pleasure because they're identifying the primordial being. I'm going to confuse you for a second. Each year, the Rebbe would give a discourse on the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, passed away in 1950. Had edited a discourse and distributed the discourse. As it turned out, the first part of the discourse was distributed for the day of his passing, the 10th of Shvat in 1950. There was the discourse was 20 chapters, and every year for the next 20 years, and then the following 18 years, the Rebbe elaborated on one of the chapters of that discourse. They're very powerful, very fascinating discourses. They have different themes. So that was in 1950. 1951 began the cycle. Then there was the next cycle began in 1971, 1991. And even though the Rebbe is no longer physically here, but we continue to study those discourses, and we're basically in the fourth cycle, right? In the 14th year of the fourth cycle. The discourse, I think 14th years. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, the 15th year. The discourse of this year shared the following idea. And I'm sharing this because I want to explain to you that God's manifestation is not, God's greatest manifestation is not actually manifest in light. It's actually manifest in darkness. So he says like this, the passage says that the light of God is L'mayla mayla adin ketz, it's above without limit, L'mata mata adin tachlis, and below without purpose or without end. So when we say we experience God in this world, what does it mean you're experiencing God in this world? How can we experience God in this world? We can only experience God in this world if God is concealed. Right? That's counterintuitive. If you want to experience God, you can only experience God if he's concealed. If God's revealed, then you're overwhelmed by the experience. So when you're experiencing something that seemingly is a usual natural event, and then you put the dots together and you realize that somebody's orchestrating this, suddenly you say, oh, I see God here. So how are you experiencing God? You're experiencing God in his concealment. So that's what it means that God is all the way below. What does it mean that God is infinitely high? So it means that God is in the space of darkness. Because as soon as I say light, it's already a revelation. It's already an expression. The highest expression of God is darkness. The highest expression of God is overwhelming to the point that you can't see anything. And we have a physical analogy for this is the sun. What's at the core of the sun? It's black. Even though the sun is the source of light, at the core of the sun, it's black. The light is so powerful that what you have is darkness. God's essence is so powerful that the first expression of it is darkness. Now, whether you understood that fully or not is not as important as the point I'm trying to make, and that is that when we experience God, we don't necessarily experience God as light. We actually experience God as darkness. In the Megillah that we're going to read Thursday night, beginning of the 6th chapter begins Balayla Hahu, and it was on that night. And our sages say that when you read the Megillah, you have to when you begin that chapter, you have to say it out loud. You have to say it loud, because that's when the real miracle began. So the Kabbalists tell us, what does it mean that's when the miracle began. So there's a technical story that the king couldn't sleep and he asked the advisors to come and so on and so forth. And Haman was just there and so on. But spiritually, something else is going on. It's specifically in the darkness, in that night, not that night, not this night, that night, because even this is already revelation. It's that night. It's a concealment. In the darkness of the experience is where God manifested himself. That's the greatness of the miracle. Which, again, my whole point is just to emphasize that our usual way we think of things as light being the expression is actually also just an analogy. Okay, hopefully I've belabored the point enough. Yes, this makes sense?
It makes sense because the first time Hashem appears to Moses, he comes through a burning bush. So imagine if you have invisible cloak and you're invisibly cloaked into that bush where you make it up. At any time you can also open up and change things. So
beautiful. Very nice. Yeah. So all of this is to tell us that when we're studying Torah, this is where God chose to put himself in a way that when we study Torah, we are studying the analogy that gives us an experience of God's essence. Now we can understand more clearly, middle of 23, the passage from our sages that we mentioned before. Fortunate, or happy is the one that comes there, meaning to the world to come, possessing his knowledge of Torah. The kamay ben nimshal mashal, just as it is with the analogy and the analog, efshar lamed ala nimshal im lo sheyavin mitchilas hamashal. Just like it's not possible to comprehend the analog if you don't first understand the parable. Then when you understand the parable, then you can understand the analog. And if we are lacking comprehension of certain elements of the analogy, then we won't be able to understand the analog properly. So therefore, since the Torah is the analogy, that through the Torah one will comprehend the analog, which is the primordial being, God. So what's the experience of paradise? What's the experience of the Garden of Eden? It's not Disneyland. It's not swimming pools and beach resorts. The Garden of Eden is a place where you get to bask in God's glory. You get to experience the divine. But if you don't know what you're experiencing, then you don't understand it's not a wonderful experience. The more Torah you study, when you show up there, you say, oh, that's what I've been studying. Now I understand. Now I can experience it. Because you've been studying the analogy. Now you get the analog. That when you fully comprehend, when you thoroughly comprehend the analogy, so then you're able to perceive the analog, which is the pleasantness of God. To satisfy his soul in a time of drought. Why is the afterlife considered a time of drought? Because the connection to God achieved in this world cannot be attained in that realm. In other words, what we experience, we can't come to the next world and then start studying Torah. By the way, it's interesting tradition that when you go into a cemetery, you tuck your tzitzis in. Why? Because I think it's from Proverbs. It says that you're not supposed to mock the poor, right? It's very cruel to mock the poor. You go into a cemetery, those that are buried there can no longer do mitzvot. They can't fulfill God's commandments. So even if you're there for a religious ceremony, that's obligatory, but keeping your tzitzis exposed is kind of saying, hey, you can't do this mitzvah, which I can do, right? So in this world, we can study the analogy. In this world, we can study Torah. We can work on grasping that. But in that world, it's too late. So in that world, whatever you didn't do in this world is considered like a drought in regards to the effort that you can put in. Conversely, so therefore, when one does not have the analogy, one is not able to comprehend the analog. Okay, so that addresses one of the questions that we had, which is, what is the meaning behind this passage that fortunate is one who comes to the next world and has their Torah with them? There was another question we asked. The question we asked, if you recall, in the first class on this discourse, was that it says that one who has the ability to study Torah and does not do so, there are serious consequences for that. The question the Alter Rebbe asked is, one who doesn't have time to study Torah gets away with his obligation of just studying one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. So it sounds like a pretty serious shift. One who doesn't have time can get away with only one chapter in the morning and one chapter in the evening. But one who does have time gets this kind of serious spiritual excommunication, premature death. Very frightening. Now, this is the beauty of Torah, that when we study Torah, those things, especially when we study with the teachings of Jewish mysticism, those things that jump out at us as very harsh actually become enlightened. So here we're gonna see an example of this. So based on what we understand, we can understand and answer the question that we asked before, that which our sages say, the chomish efshli lasi b'teirve inaisik alav nemari karis tikaris, that one who has the ability to involve themselves in Torah study and does not do so, the verse states that their soul will surely be cut off. Afagav the misha efshli dai b'perik echad shachris u'perik echad arvis, whereas one who does have the potential to study Torah, one who does not have time to study Torah can satisfy their obligation with one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. So why the contrast? The explanation is as follows. By way of analogy, right? We're using an analogy to explain the analogy. The analogy is that just like you have an analogy and an analog, Sheyesh seichel v'nimshal asher yechelim lamed lav ayidei mashal echad upashat v'kal. V'yesh seichel gadol yoser shekidei lahasiga ayidei mishalim yoser v'gam mashal l'nalav amak yoser. Just like there are different levels of intellectual ideas, and some intellectual ideas, which are, so to speak, lower intellectual ideas, you can comprehend them with fewer analogies and easier analogies. Ideas that are more profound, more complex, you need more analogies and deeper analogies. So just like we can have contrasts within intellectual ideas and within analogies to explain those intellectual ideas, so similarly, in the afterlife, the experience of the soul in the afterlife is also not equal. There are infinite numbers of levels of experiences that souls have in the world to come. And again, this is very practical in our experience, right? We can have multiple spiritual experiences. You can have a spiritual experience when you pray. You can have a spiritual experience on Shabbos. You can have a spiritual experience on Yom Kippur. Each of us in our relationship with God have different experiences. So how much more so when we shed the body and the soul is experiencing the divine, it can have many layers of experience. And our sages explain this by way of analogy, that every righteous person in the world to come is burned from the canopy of the other person. The imagery is that each person is sitting in their own canopy in the world to come, and they're experiencing divine revelation. The canopy is an encompassing energy, which represents that it's very powerful. And since some souls are not at the level of the souls of the others that are sitting in the adjacent canopy, so they get burned. They get burned by the other canopy because they're not able to comprehend. What happens when you can't comprehend something? I remember studying something. I don't want to deviate. Okay, I'll deviate. When the Rebbe first introduced the idea of studying Maimonides, so most of Maimonides is easy. It's comprehensible. But Maimonides has a whole section called Kiddush HaChodesh, the laws of the sanctification of the moon. Amongst the things that Maimonides was well versed in was astronomy. And I forget how many chapters, it's 25 plus chapters, where he describes how the galaxies work and the cycle of the moon, because there's a mitzvah to sanctify the new moon. So how do you sanctify the new moon? You have to know when the new moon is being born, when the first crescent of the new moon is visible. So he goes through the descriptions of the galaxies, and he goes through all the mathematical equations, and you have all these rabbis and chassids who just started learning Maimonides for the first time, and suddenly they're introduced to this stuff which is Chinese to them. So they brought in a professor I was in yeshiva in LA at the time, they brought in a professor from UCLA, who was also a Chabadnik, who's a scientist, and he was explaining these laws over a week or so. Every night he studied the chapters corresponding to that day. So I remember a rabbi who became my rabbi, Rabbi Levitansky. He was a funny guy. He was a very expressive guy. And he says, "I don't know what you're talking about. My brain is fried." Like is a rabbi. He's a great rabbi, but like, what are you talking about? Like, this stuff is frying my brain, right? What does that mean? His brain's not fried, right? But the information is so overwhelming that you get burned up in it. So in the Garden of Eden, you have some souls that are very high, and they're experiencing divine revelation, and the souls that are adjacent to them are not at a level where they can comprehend what that one is experiencing. So what happens? They get burned up. Doesn't mean literally they get burned up. They become overwhelmed. They become nullified in the experience. I'm going to skip the parentheses for a second. Middle of 27. So, v'hainu dafke kashi efshar lo lasikhu. Shazu hayra shadai lebezeh. When a person only has the ability, listen to this teaching, it's very profound. When a person only has the ability to study Torah in the morning and in the evening, in other words, if God brought a person to a circumstance where they can only study Torah in the morning and the evening, that means that the study of Torah that they will do in the morning and the evening is adequate for them to have the analogy to be able to experience the divine revelation in the next world. Either because they're not going to be allotted a higher revelation, or because the nature of their soul is such that that's adequate for them to experience the greatest divine revelations. In other words, if I'm teaching a profound intellectual idea, and you get it after one analogy, that's a commentary on your ability to understand this idea. If the other person needs 10 analogies, that's a commentary on their ability to comprehend. What the Alter Rebbe is telling us here is it's not just their ability to comprehend, but the nature of their soul. So if God orchestrated it such that one person only has the time to study one analogy in the morning, one analogy in the evening, one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening, that's adequate for them so that in the world to come, they can get what they need out of that experience. They'll be able to comprehend. But if you need 10 analogies and you only satisfy yourself with one, you're not going to get the message. You're not going to get the idea. So when you come to the next world and you didn't study a lot of Torah, your soul is disconnected from the experience. That's what it's telling us. One who has the ability to study Torah. That means that he has the ability to comprehend in the world to come something even greater. So this person also needs to study Torah, a lot of it. because so that he's empowered, he's equipped in the world to come to be able to comprehend. To study Torah, which is the analogy for the primordial being, that he's equipped to be able to experience that. And therefore, when a person doesn't study as much Torah as they could be studying Torah, so he's lacking out on the adequate analogies to be able to comprehend the subject matter. And therefore, the phrase says that the soul will be surely cut off. Because the person lacks the analogy, they lack the comprehension. In other words, the point out there is telling us is, we're not telling you there's this punishment, this terrible punishment that one who doesn't study Torah is going to have their soul cut off. Like God's going to come and say, oh, you didn't study Torah, I'm going to cut your soul off. Like all punishment in Torah, it's actually consequence. Like the Mishnah in Ethics says that what is the reward for a mitzvah? It's the mitzvah itself. What's the consequence for a sin? It's the sin itself. Right? When somebody violates a relationship, the biggest consequence is that the relationship itself is fractured. And what's the greatest reward for nurturing a relationship? It's the relationship. You don't need to get a prize and you don't need to get a punishment. When you want to be connected to God, you do a mitzvah, you're connected to God. You don't need to get a prize. And when one transgresses, we become disconnected. That's the consequence. So this passage is telling us is that one who has the ability to study Torah, which is another way of saying God has equipped you with the tools that you can experience profound divine revelation, but you're not preparing yourself. If you're not preparing yourself, you won't have the experience. Your soul will be disconnected from the experience. Whereas one who, by divine design, can only has time to study in the morning and the evening, that's a commentary that it's adequate for them to study that one parable in the morning, one parable in the evening, and as a result have the comprehension that's allotted to them in the world to come. Does it make sense? Yes?
One question.
Yes.
They will be allotted an inferior status.
Who?
Sounds like. The one who, for whatever reason, didn't have time to do much study, when he or she goes to the Gan Eden.
So let's go back to 27. It's a great question. That's why he puts in parentheses on 27. That one who has only time to study one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening, that this analogy is sufficient for the comprehension of godliness appropriate for the source of that person's soul. So your conclusion is not necessarily correct. In other words, it could be you have two people listening to the intellectual idea. And one person hears one analogy and they got it. The other person needs 10 analogies. The person who hears one analogy and understands the subject matter, it could be that they're that smart that one analogy was enough for them.
That's the person who didn't have time to do a lot of study.
It could also be, no, not necessarily. It could also be that the person is so smart that with one analogy, they comprehended the depth of the idea. Conversely, the person who needs 10 analogies, it could be because they're not that smart, so therefore they need 10 analogies. It could also be that where the person who got one analogy, the person who needs 10 already understood it at one. But they're so profoundly deep that every time you give them another analogy, they understand it on a totally different dimension. So what the Alter Rebbe is telling us is not a commentary on the specific nature of that soul, whether it's a higher or lower soul, whether they're going to experience a higher or lower revelation. The reality is that what they experience for this person in this world is the fact that they only have time to study one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening, means that relative to their soul's level, that's all they need. Now, that could mean that relative to their soul's level, they're only going to receive a lower revelation. So therefore, one analogy in the morning, one analogy is adequate. And it could also mean that their soul is so profound that with one analogy, they can already comprehend the depths of the teachings. So I don't think the Alter Rebbe is giving us a conclusive descriptor of which one's soul is higher. Each person's on their own journey, which is really, it's very, very empowering and comforting. If a person only has time to study one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening, they can bemoan their fate. I only can study one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. So the Alter Rebbe is telling us is that's all you need. The fact that God put you in such a circumstance means that's all you need. Conversely, the person who's studying Torah all day, they may need more. Or it could be that this particular person's nature of their soul is such that they will be able to achieve really high levels if they study Torah all day.
But you're not denying that there are levels.
Absolutely.
So somebody ends up with the short stick, so to speak, for whatever reason. Doesn't get the full picture, doesn't get the closeness that others get. Is that remedied by the mitzvahs that he gets credit for, he or she gets credit for, raising him?
So I don't want to answer the question. I want to go to the core of the question. The core of the question is this presumption that different levels of souls, one ends up with the short end of the stick. But you're using human measurement to evaluate that. And the reality is, number one, that all souls, as the Alter Rebbe elaborates in chapter 3 and 4 of Tanya, or 2 and 3 of Tanya, chapter 2 of Tanya. I'm forgetting. One of the early chapters of Tanya. Where the Alter Rebbe poses the question that if all souls originate in the same source, so how come we have distinctions among souls? We have souls of leaders and souls of followers, and we have earlier generations and later generations. The Alter Rebbe basically says is that all souls are the same in their origin. But as they go through their journeys and for each unique purpose, the souls adopt different garments, they adopt different clothing. My favorite analogy that I made up, which means it may not be a great analogy, but it works, is if you were to get on a train on the East Coast, you're traveling to the West Coast, you take a theoretical bullet train. I don't think they ever actually created them, but you get on that train and 10 hours later, you're on the West Coast. You're the same person pretty much as you were at your destination as you were when you left, right? In a certain sense, there's a purity there. But if you take, the train and you stop at each station and you spend a week there, when you arrive at your destination, you're a different person. You've adopted experiences from along the way. You're essentially the same person. But you've adopted, you've put on experiences along the way. All souls originate in the same place. And all souls, human souls, end up in the same place. But there's a lot of worlds and a lot of spiritual levels that we journey through before we come into this world. And along the way, some souls pass all the way through. And actually, in this context, they're considered higher souls because there's less concealment along the way. They're the same pure when they arrive as when they left. It says like Moshe was known as a neshama da'atzilus. He was the soul of the world of emanation. Other souls are souls of bria, of the worlds of creation. It doesn't mean that that's where they originate. It means that that's where they stop. And they adopt those properties. And then other souls are worlds of Yitzir, and some are the world of Asiya. So it's not a disadvantage. Everybody's got a purpose. Moses had a purpose, so he needed to have that level of purity. Others have a purpose to be in the trenches, so they have lower souls, lower experiential souls, because they have a job that in a certain sense is greater than Moses. Actually, it says that Moses looked at the souls of the later generations. He looked at the souls of what's known as the heels of Mashiach, and he was humbled by it. He was the greatest soul, but he looked at us and he said, wow, I'm afraid of that generation. That's the challenges that those people have. Like, I don't want those challenges, right? So that's the Moses experience. Does that answer your question?
I got a question that's kind of opposite what you mentioned, not that I'm thinking it's all along the way. So I kept thinking while you were talking is how does this vote elevates your soul, right? So Torah is another way to elevate your soul, or is it just two different paths that you got to have both? In other words, while you're talking, well, how about the person who does mitzvahs, they're like 90% of the day? Okay, then you gotta, in other words, so you have to have both, right?
Yeah.
But they're different. They're different avenues, correct?
Yeah,
They're not
yeah.
the same.
So later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that Torah is the food and the mitzvahs are the clothing. Spiritually, in the world to come, you can have all this wonderful revelation, but you also need garments to be able to experience it. Here we're only talking about the revelation part and the ability to comprehend what you're experiencing, right? But we also need garments. The garments protect us from getting burned up. The garments protect us. So the mitzvahs are the garments. So again, what's really important from these questions is to understand that there's not a human formula, right? This is not a mathematical equation that says all mitzvahs are equal, all Torah is equal, all people are equal, and therefore, if you just do enough mitzvahs and enough Torah, you're going to get the prize at the end. It doesn't work that way. Every person has a unique design, a unique purpose that God put us on this earth. And for example, one who the design of their life is such that they can and do spend most of their day doing mitzvot, it means potentially that the revelation that they're going to experience as a result of their Torah is much more intense. And therefore they have all these garments to experience it. Conversely, someone who spends their whole day studying Torah and does fewer mitzvot, again, if that's the structure that God designed for them, that's a commentary that their ability to experience profound divine revelation, needing less garments is their purpose. And at the end of the day, we can't really know that, exactly what that looks like for us, which is why each of us have to look at our life circumstances and recognize that God is the orchestrator of our life circumstances, and therefore we have to make the most of what God has given us. So if God has given us the ability to study Torah, and this is really what he's saying here, is that one who only has the ability to study Torah in the morning and in the evening, that's a commentary about the nature of their soul, that's enough for them. But one who has the ability to study Torah all day and doesn't, that's God basically saying to them, listen, I got some really good juice for you up here. But if you're not going to do the work, you're not going to get it. You're not going to experience it. And the truth is, the same as with mitzvot, right? If someone who is empowered to do many mitzvot because of their skill set, because of their talents, because of their life circumstances. We were speaking about this yesterday in the Hasidus class before davening, that certain people are given a gift of wealth. Imagine somebody is given a gift of wealth and they keep it all to themselves, right? And you can do whatever you want, but if God has given you a gift of wealth, and I say wealth, I mean whatever income God gives us, whatever level of income we have, some of it is for us and some of it is to give away. If a person doesn't give away what God has given to them to give away, then they're not fulfilling their purpose. Conversely, if somebody, the Talmud says that one shouldn't give away too much at the expense of your own family, right? So there's a balance there. It's like too much exercise, too little exercise. There's not a rule. If your heart is not strong, don't be running marathons. It's good to run a marathon, but only if you're equipped for it. If you're not equipped for it, don't do it. So each person is given their own unique design. Certain foods work for one person, certain foods work for another person. And at the end of the day, as the saying goes, wherever you go, there you are, right? So each of us are given us to live this life, and we have to recognize that and show up and make the most of our own life according to the circumstances that God has given us. L'chaim. All right, next week we begin chapter 2, and we'll slowly work our way through. Looks like you need a nap now.